Most people do not get rich because they cannot recognize a storm. They get poor because they keep calling the storm a buying signal, a selling signal, a headline, a temporary scare, a geopolitical event, a tech correction, an inflation print, a rate decision, a tariff issue, an oil shock, or a chart pattern, but they never build the one thing that matters when the sky goes black. A shelter. If you want the brutal truth, the market does not punish ignorance first. It punishes exposure. You can be wrong and survive if your structure is right. You can be smart and still get financially crippled if your structure is weak. That is the part most people never understand. They think investing is about being right about the next headline. I have spent my entire life learning that the real money is made by the person who builds a shelter strong enough to keep acting while everyone else is running in circles outside. That is why 2026 matters. Not because I enjoy drama, not because I want to terrify you, not because I think every scary chart deserves a sermon. It matters because the pattern is visible again. And when patterns repeat, the crowd repeats right along with them. I have watched this movie more times than most people have watched their favorite television show. The names change, the slogans change, the excuses change, the commentators change, the apps get prettier, the charts get cleaner, the ETFs get cheaper, the panic gets faster. But the human nervous system does not change. In 2022, the market dropped hard. People acted as though the world had developed a brand new disease called uncertainty. It had not. It had merely rediscovered the old disease called leverage mixed with fear, inflated expectations, energy shocks, and a sudden loss of certainty about the future. Then, what happened after the pain, after the selling, after the hand-wringing, after the false confidence, after the apocalyptic language? The market delivered extraordinary returns in the years that followed. That is what people remember too late. They remember the drop while it is happening. They remember the recovery after it is gone. And because they do not understand the machinery underneath either phase, they sell in the first act and regret in the third. You need to understand something very clearly. A bear market is not just a decline in price. It is a stress test for your shelter. It asks one question and one question only. Do you have a system that can keep you rational while the weather turns violent? Most people do not. They have opinions. They have watch lists. They have hot takes. They have a cousin with a brokerage account. They have a feed full of people who became experts last Tuesday. What they do not have is a shelter. And if you do not have a shelter, every hard season feels personal. Every decline feels like betrayal. Every red screen feels like evidence that you were foolish to begin with. Every delay in rate cuts feels like an ambush. Every oil spike feels like the start of permanent collapse. Every war headline feels like a command to liquidate. That is why the same event can turn one person into a future owner of great assets and turn another person into a lifetime spectator. The event is the same, the shelter is different. When I look at the setup in 2026, what I see is not a need for prophecy. I see an old sequence beginning to rhyme. In 2022, one of the major sources of fear came from geopolitical conflict. You saw supply chains strain, you saw commodities surge, you saw food and energy pressure feed through the real economy. You saw investors discover, once again, that the market is not a floating abstraction. It is attached to ships, pipelines, factories, ports, truck routes, fertilizer, diesel, and appetite. Now look again. Oil pressure returns, conflict in the Middle East raises obvious fears and several less obvious ones. Most people only notice gasoline when it reaches the pump. They do not notice what happens before that. They do not see the freight cost. They do not see the shipping cost. They do not see the airline fuel cost. They do not see the farm input cost. They do not see the fertilizer chain tighten. They do not see the commodity pressure start to leak into everything that sits on a shelf. They wait until inflation hits the cashier. That is how the unsheltered mind works. It does not think in systems. It thinks in delayed pain. Then consider the second layer. In 2022, people feared a technology bubble. Today they give the fear a fresher label. Now it is the AI bubble. The costume changes, but the crowd's behavior does not. When too much hope gets concentrated in too few names, and valuations outrun patience, the crowd always tells itself a fairy tale while prices are rising and a horror story when prices fall. Both stories are usually exaggerated. That is another reason people lose money. They move from fantasy to panic without ever passing through analysis. They call expensive things revolutionary on the way up, then call the same things worthless on the way down. And in both cases, they are really just translating price action into emotion. I do not invest that way. I never wanted a portfolio that required me to feel brave every morning. I wanted a structure that let me remain boring when the world became theatrical. Now add the third layer. In 2022, inflation and rate hikes ripped through expectations. In 2026, the mechanism looks different on the surface but rhymes underneath. Instead of the shock coming from aggressive tightening against already raging inflation, the shock now comes from the crowd discovering that the cuts they expected may not arrive in the way they imagined. The disappointment is different. The emotional damage is the same. That matters more than most people think. Markets do not merely react to events. They react to the distance between fantasy and reality. If the market is already priced in relief, and relief does not come, that gap becomes pressure. If investors already assume cheaper money, easier conditions, faster support, and a painless continuation of the good times, then a steady hand from the central bank can feel to them like a punch in the throat. Again, the weather is not the whole story, the shelter is. Then you add the supply chain strain on top of that, energy shipping, tariffs, agricultural inputs, supplier instability, businesses reworking logistics, margins getting squeezed, consumers meeting those costs at the checkout line, investors suddenly remembering that inflation is not only a number on a screen, it is a chain reaction. This is where ordinary people begin to crack, not because they are weak, because they are mentally overexposed. They built a portfolio for sunshine and then act surprised that it behaves badly in rain. That is the great mistake. A real investor does not build for the average day. A real investor builds for the day when every weak instinct becomes louder than every intelligent principle. That day is where fortunes separate. Let me explain the hidden mechanism that ruins most households. People imagine that market losses hurt because prices fall. That is not the deepest injury. The deeper injury is behavioral liquidation. A decline by itself is temporary. Panic-driven abandonment can become permanent. This is why I pay so much attention to shelters. I am not obsessed with drama. I am obsessed with survivability. If you sell solid assets because the weather darkened, you do not just lose current value. You break the compounding chain, you step out of the shelter and tell yourself you will return when it feels safer. Then the market rebounds before your fear does, prices rise, you mistrust the rise, you wait for confirmation, confirmation comes higher, you hesitate again. Before long the opportunity is gone and you are telling yourself a new lie about prudence. I have watched people do this with depressing consistency. They tell themselves they are being careful. What they are really doing is outsourcing their judgment to discomfort. That is expensive. You should remember this for the rest of your life. The market rarely rewards emotional honesty. It rewards structural discipline. If your process depends on you feeling calm before you act, you do not have a process. You have weather-dependent courage. And weather-dependent courage disappears exactly when it is needed. That is why the 26th of May become one of those rare periods that matter disproportionately for two groups of people. The first group is newer investors. The second group is people near or in retirement. The new investor faces the storm without scar tissue. The temptation is to interpret volatility as proof that investing itself was foolish. The near retirement investor faces the same storm but with a different fear. The fear is not only loss, it is sequence risk. It is the feeling that one bad stretch can permanently damage the future. Those are real fears, but fear without structure creates worse outcomes than volatility itself. You do not solve that by guessing bottoms. You solve it by designing a shelter that already told you what to do before the storm arrived. That is where almost all serious wealth comes from. Not brilliance, not prediction, not charisma, preparation. Preparation is one of the most underrated forms of leverage in finance. It gives you emotional borrowing power. It lets you use rational behavior when others are forced to liquidate their future to satisfy present discomfort. When I bought businesses, I was never trying to look impressive. I was trying to own cash, producing structures that could keep functioning under pressure. The same principle applies to your investing life. You should not be trying to look sophisticated in a bull market. You should be trying to remain functional in a bear market. That means you need your own storm shelter. Now let me tell you what that shelter is not. It is not a collection of half-remembered quotes. It is not a folder of screenshots. It is not 10 different opinions from people who all sound confident for a living. It is not a mood. It is not a vague intention to buy low. It is not constant tinkering. It is not waking up every morning and asking whether today feels like a good day to invest. It is not waiting for the market to tell you what your own rules should be. That is not a shelter. That is a tent in a hurricane. A real shelter begins with written rules. You need a personal investment policy, whether you use that name or not. You need a written operating code that tells you what you own, why you own it, what percentage belongs where, what new cash does automatically, what happens during corrections, what happens during bear markets, what you rebalance, what you ignore, what you never chase, and what you refuse to sell, merely because fear got louder. I like written rules because they reduce self-deception. Most people are not liars when it comes to money. They are improvisers. Improvisation is deadly in a storm. If you have not already decided how you will behave during a correction, you have quietly decided to let your adrenaline decide for you. That is not strategy. That is surrender. The second part of a real shelter is account design. People talk endlessly about returns while ignoring plumbing. That is another expensive habit. If your accounts are scattered, your contributions irregular, your risk exposures confused, and your automatic flows non-existent, you are not investing. You are wandering. A shelter needs structure. Where does new money land? What gets bought? What gets rebalanced? What is tax advantaged? What is liquid? What is reserved for near-term needs? What belongs in broad equity exposure? What belongs in safer ballast if you are near withdrawal years? If you cannot answer those questions cleanly, fear will answer them messily. The third part of a shelter is automation. I want you to understand how big this is. Automation is not a convenience feature. It is a behavioral defense system. It removes negotiation. It takes one of the most dangerous forces in finance, your day-to-day mood, and strips it of authority. When money moves on schedule, when contributions occur without drama, when the habit continues through sunshine and through panic, compounding can finally do what most people claim they want while behaving in the exact opposite way. Most investors say they believe in long-term ownership. Very few build machinery that can survive short-term fear. Automation is what bridges that hypocrisy. That is why it matters. The fourth part of a real shelter is stress testing. I do not trust a plan that only works in one weather pattern. A portfolio should be examined in heat, cold, flood, drought, panic, euphoria, inflation, stalled growth, and disappointment. You should know in advance what happens if stocks fall 20%, if rate cuts are delayed, if energy spikes, if the technology leaders correct sharply, if headlines get worse before they get better, if the rebound comes early, or if the pain lingers. The point is not to eliminate uncertainty. The point is to eliminate improvisation. That distinction is everything. Now, let me take you deeper into the psychological damage that storms inflict on the unsheltered investor. First comes shock. Prices fall. The investor who believed they were long-term discovers they were actually emotionally short-term. Then comes information addiction. They begin refreshing, reading, scrolling, searching, comparing, asking, interpreting, second-guessing, and making themselves more fragile with every hour of new input. Then comes premature sophistication. They start talking about rotating to safety, waiting for clarity, holding dry powder, timing re-entry, seeing what the Fed does, watching geopolitical escalation, monitoring inflation, and respecting uncertainty. It sounds intelligent. It often means they are freezing. Then comes self-narration. They begin telling themselves stories about prudence. They call inaction discipline. They call fear patience. They call surrender humility. They call confusion nuance. Then comes the real damage. The market stabilizes before they do. That is the cruel mathematics of panic price, often recovers faster than confidence. The investor who sold waits for a better entry, the better entry passes. Then they demand an even better entry because they missed the first one. Eventually, the market goes from insultingly cheap to merely expensive enough that they are willing to return. And by then the asymmetry is gone. That pattern has ruined more families than bad stock selection. I want that sentence to bother you because most people spend their time trying to find the perfect fund, the perfect stock, the perfect sector, the perfect signal. The perfect shelter matters more. If you had bought solid productive assets after severe fear in previous cycles and simply remained disciplined, you would have done better than an extraordinary number of people who spent those same periods trying to outsmart the weather. You do not need genius to benefit from storms. You need protection from your own instincts. That is why I care about broad ownership tools when used correctly. A sensible ETF framework, a rational allocation, automatic buying, a documented policy, and a refusal to improvise can outperform armies of anxious dabblers who are permanently one headline away from betraying themselves. People make a great mistake with bear markets. They imagine the money is made in the thrill. The money is made in the structure that allows you to keep buying or at least keep holding when the thrill has turned to nausea. A bear market is a transfer mechanism. It transfers future return from the emotionally overexposed to the structurally prepared. That is the hidden engine. And because those periods occupy a smaller portion of total market time, they feel rare while they are happening. People do not want them. They do not feel lucky. They feel scared. Yet those are often the stretches where future wealth is quietly repriced in favor of the disciplined. You will not feel that in the moment. That is why you need a shelter instead of a feeling. Let us talk about retirement for a moment because this is where people become especially fragile. If you are close to retirement, you should not pretend that volatility is harmless. That would be foolish. But you also should not let fear bully you into destroying the long-term logic of ownership. Your shelter may need a stronger concrete foundation, more cash for near-term spending, more clarity about withdrawals, better sequencing, greater attention to what years of spending are already protected and what years remain exposed to equity recovery. That is rational. What is not rational is turning a temporary market storm into permanent self-sabotage. There is a large difference between respecting sequence risk and worshiping safety. One is planning, the other is surrender. The new investor has a different temptation. The new investor wants certainty before commitment. That is impossible. The market does not hand beginners emotional comfort and future returns at the same time. Usually you choose one. If you insist on comfort first, you will often buy later, higher, and with less upside. That is why I tell people something they do not always enjoy hearing. Your first real edge in investing is not intelligence. It is emotional sobriety. Can you keep contributing while the news becomes theatrical? Can you keep your allocation when the crowd declares a new era of permanent danger? Can you avoid turning every correction into a referendum on your worth? Can you refuse to chase every narrative that appears to offer safety? Can you sit still long enough for ownership to work? These sound like soft questions. They are not. They are capital allocation questions wearing psychological clothes. Now let me give you the economic math underneath the storm shelter. When markets fall, expected future returns from productive assets often improve, not because the world becomes safe, but because the price you pay for future earnings becomes lower. If fear compresses valuations while underlying earning power remains durable across time, then the investor with shelter acquires a better bargain than the investor who required sunny weather before acting. This is basic, but the crowd does not live in basics. The crowd lives in sensation. When prices rise, the crowd feels intelligent and buys optimism. When prices fall, the crowd feels endangered and buys reassurance. That is backward. The shelter reverses that logic. The shelter says, I will not let present discomfort rewrite long-term math. That is powerful. You should also understand why the headlines in this kind of environment become so dangerous. Each headline seems to justify waiting oil up. Wait, conflict expanding. Wait, Fed holding steady. Wait, AI names correcting. Wait, supply chains tightening. Wait, tariffs rising. Wait, fertilizer prices climbing. Wait, consumer squeeze. Wait, recession fears. Wait, you can wait yourself into poverty, not overnight, quietly, respectably, intelligently. That is the most dangerous kind, because you will always have reasons. The world is excellent at producing reasons to postpone ownership. The one thing it rarely produces is a perfect invitation. If you insist on a perfect invitation, you will spend your life studying storms from outside the shelter. That is why I have more respect for a plain written system than for 1,000 elegant opinions. A written system can be ugly and still make you rich. An elegant opinion can be brilliant and still make you poor. I would rather have a dull shelter in a real storm than a poetic speech in the rain. The unsheltered investor keeps searching for reassurance. The sheltered investor keeps following rules. That difference compounds. And once it compounds, it changes your life in ways most people underestimate. You sleep differently, you interpret news differently, you stop expecting the market to comfort you, you stop asking every decline for permission, you stop treating volatility like a moral insult, you stop believing that action and transaction are the same thing. You begin to understand one of the most valuable shifts in finance. A real system does not remove pain. It removes self-betrayal. That is enough. Now I want to address a common confusion. Some people hear a message like this and think I am telling them that every dip must be bought aggressively, that every fear event is a gift, that valuation never matters, or that all risk is imaginary. If you just keep repeating the word long-term, that would be nonsense. What I am telling you is harder and more useful. You need a shelter strong enough to distinguish between volatility and permanent impairment, between temporary fear and broken economics, between theater and structural damage. That requires thought. It requires allocation discipline. It requires understanding what you own. It requires rules. It requires proportion. It requires patience. It requires a willingness to be less dramatic than the age you live in. That is why the shelter metaphor matters so much. A shelter is not denial. It is preparation. If you live in a storm-prone place and build reinforced walls, that does not mean you think storms are fake. It means you understand reality better than the person who decorated a glass house and called it confidence. A lot of modern investing is glass. House confidence. People think because they can buy in seconds, sell in seconds, view a chart in seconds, and hear an expert in seconds. They are in control. Speed is not control. Speed without structure is just faster panic. That is another reason 2026 matters. Technology has given fear distribution. It can now flood your nervous system at industrial speed. Every oil move, every conflict rumor, every policy comment, every red candlestick, every analyst downgrade, every breathless thread, every supposed historical parallel can arrive instantly and demand an emotional response. Your shelter is what says no. No, I already decided how much equity I own. No, I already know what my rebalancing bands are. No, I already know what happens when prices fall. No, I am not redesigning my life because the market had a bad quarter. No, I am not confusing volatility with evidence that ownership itself was a mistake. No, I am not going to turn a temporary drawdown into a permanent failure by demanding emotional comfort before rational action. That kind of refusal power is one of the most valuable financial assets on earth. Most people never build it. They build income, they build consumption, they build opinions, they build identities. Very few build refusal power. but refusal power is what keeps your shelter standing when every weak incentive tries to pull you out of it. And here is the final thing most people miss about storms. Storms do not merely test portfolios, they test identity. Are you a buyer of future productive capacity, or are you a renter of current confidence? That is the real divide. The renter of current confidence feels wealthy only when prices rise, headlines calm down, and everyone agrees. The buyer of future productive capacity knows that prices and comfort often travel in opposite directions. When comfort is abundant, bargains are scarce. When bargains appear, comfort disappears. That is not a flaw in the market. That is the admission ticket. You want the reward without the discomfort. Everyone does. That is why very few people get extraordinary results. They want a smooth road to a destination that only rough weather can meaningfully discount. I am not promising you a painless period ahead. I am telling you pain is often the discount. And if you are prepared for that truth instead of offended by it, 2026 can become one of those years you look back on not as the year the market frightened you, but as the year you finally built a structure stronger than your own fear. That is the right ambition. Not to predict the next week, not to impress strangers, not to collect financial jargon, not to perform intelligence, to build a shelter so rational, so plain, so disciplined, and so automatic that when the weather turns ugly, you do not have to become a hero. You only have to remain yourself. That is a much easier standard. It is also a much more profitable one. So here is the test. When the next wave of headlines hits, when oil surges again, when the market opens red, when a central banker disappoints the crowd, when technology corrects, when supply chains strain, when inflation fears reawaken, when your neighbor starts sounding certain that cash is king and danger is everywhere, what exactly will you do? Not what sounds wise, not what feels safest. What will you do according to a rule you already wrote? Because if the answer is that you will decide later, then later has already defeated you. If the answer is that you will wait to see how you feel, then the storm already owns you. If the answer is that you will keep chasing clarity from the same people who never have to bear the cost of your hesitation, then you are not investing. You are renting borrowed conviction. But if the answer is that you know your allocation, you know your buying schedule, you know your rebalance triggers, you know your emergency reserves, you know your risk tolerance, you know your withdrawal plan, and you know exactly how to keep acting when the sky turns dark, then you finally understand what I have spent a lifetime trying to teach. The market does not hand freedom to the person with the loudest forecast. It hands freedom to the person who built the strongest shelter before the rain began. Now you have to choose what kind of person you are. The one who studies storms from the parking lot and calls that prudence, or the one who walks inside, bolts the door, and lets discipline outlast weather.